name is Beck and welcome to a bunch of books that I'm going to DNF, which means did not finish. Essentially, that is BookTube shorthand for I'm not going to continue the rest of the series, I'm putting them down now. So the first book on this list is Arusha and the End of Time. I'm actually quite disappointed because I really wanted to love this, but I think the pacing and the actual story just weren't particularly for me, and that's kind of understandable given that this is a middle grade book and I'm almost 30. So I could love this because I loved the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, and this is a Rick Riordan Presents work, but I don't know what it was. I just couldn't love it. So I gave it about 3 stars, and it had a great kind of vibe to it. It had a great atmosphere, and Arusha was a great character, but honestly, it just wasn't for me. It didn't rustle me to continue. I wasn't particularly obsessed with it, so I'm putting it down because if I push myself to read things, then my momentum is going to go out the window, and I don't want to do that in 2022. So unfortunately, I'm not continuing Arusha and the End of Time. And I'm also unfortunately not continuing Fireborn. This is a young adult fantasy series, and it has awesome politics in here. It had a great setup, but I just don't feel the motivation to continue. I did like this book. It wasn't a bad book, but I just don't feel particularly motivated to continue it. And that's really the general vibe of this video. I don't feel motivated to continue these series. I'm not particularly obsessed with the characters or the themes in these works, even though generally I think most of them I kind of enjoyed. They're just not books that I will go out of my way to pick up the sequels for, and unfortunately that was Fireborn. I think I gave it a 3.5 stars when I read it, maybe a 4, probably a 3.5 though, because upon reflection it's definitely a 3.5, and I don't love it as much as a 4-star book. So I liked it, but it's just not one that I'm going to continue, unfortunately. And I've seen this on Elliot Brooks's channel. Usually our taste in fantasy is quite similar, and so I thought that I would love this, but I just enjoyed it, and now I need to move on. Similarly, I saw The Ninth Reign on Elliot Brooks's channel, and these are 2 books that she's loved, but I've just not really found passion for them. So The Ninth Reign is a book that I DNF'd at about 130 pages, and I just couldn't find my motivation again to read it because I didn't connect to the characters in here. It's an adult fantasy, it's multiple perspective. It has this cool concept about vampire kinds of creatures that used to be connected to nature, and then their god tree died, and now they've had to go from eating its sap to eating human blood, and it's resulted in a massive blood plague. There is not just that going on, there's an apocalyptic event, I think, and these creatures are here that are killing and draining people of life force. So there's a bunch of stuff going on that sounds quite interesting, and there's also a nunnery or a prison with these women that can wield fire using the life energy of somebody. So it's got all of the hallmarks of an awesome setup to a fantasy book, but I don't know what it was. Maybe the writing style, maybe the pace. I just couldn't get invested in this, but that just means it's not a book for me, but it's probably a book that other people will love instead. And then I have a series on here that is probably going to disappoint a lot of fans, but it's really rejuvenating for me to say, and I am DNFing The Wheel of Time. I'm not going to continue reading that series. I did at one point get the audiobook for book 3 because I was like, maybe I will continue, but at the same time, I just don't feel like I will. So I'm DNFing The Wheel of Time. I've read the first 2 books. I gave the first book 4 stars. I gave the second book 2 stars. It put me in a 6-month-long reading slump. I'm not going to continue because I value my sanity. And I think The Wheel of Time is a series that I would have probably connected to when I read it a lot younger, but now that I've read a lot of fantasy, I know what I like, I know what I look for, I'm just not caring about it, so I just don't feel the need to continue reading it, because why push myself through an 800-page book when I can read something else that I really enjoy? So goodbye, Wheel of Time. And then unfortunately I've also got Jade City on here by Fonda Lee. This is a book that is about a gang family in a fantasy world where jade is their power and their currency, and jade gives different people different abilities. It's heightened senses and almost supernatural powers, and so this gang really controls the inflow of jade in this particular city, and so it follows 4 members of this particular family, and I really liked the general concepts, but again the pacing was just really strung out, and so it took me 2 months I think to read this audiobook, and so I didn't really struggle with the names. I found that okay, but I just didn't really care about the way that the story was unfolding, and to continue on from something that I didn't love in the first place, I think it's just going to be a bit of a slog. So because of all the detail, because of the pacing, I'm not continuing this one either. And I know that a lot of people love this series, but again, it's just not my jam, so I need to let it go. It's really hard to let stuff go like this because I genuinely really want to enjoy it. But in this case, I don't want to sabotage my 2022 reading, and so I really just need to let it go. I've also unfortunately got Martha Wells on this list, and she wrote the Murderbot Diaries, and I've read the first 2 books in this series and given them about 3.5 stars each. They're a series that are really conceptually interesting. So we follow Murderbot, and they are an android/human, and they are employed to be like a security bot or an assassin essentially, and it follows them because they don't want to work. They've got a lot of anxiety and social anxiety, and they just want to chill out and watch their TV shows, and they don't want to do all of like the hard stuff that is involved in killing people and protecting people. They just want to like chill by themselves. And I can really relate to that tone and that energy, but at the same time, I just didn't love the way that the stories were executed. I found them hard to connect to. Even though I liked bits and pieces, I just didn't love the overall, I guess, execution of the stories. And I'm being very vague because I don't want to spoil anything, because I don't want to say anything about the second book if you haven't read the first, etc., etc. So it's just a series that wasn't for me. I thought it would be, and then it wasn't. And so I'm trying to love more sci-fi books, but unfortunately the Murderbot Diaries is not for me. But I think Martha Wells is writing a fantasy book, and it's coming out maybe this year, so I need to look into that instead, because I think if it was a long form book with more characters, I would enjoy it, but just Murderbot, the way that it was formatted, like the style of it, wasn't for me. So maybe I will look into Martha Wells in the future, but at the moment for Murderbot, it's not my thing. Okay, so we've only got 2 more on this list, and the next one is Theft of Swords. This is an older style fantasy book, but it's written in a contemporary setting, I think. So it was written recently, but it just felt tonally like a very old book. And I think that's why I struggled to connect with it, because I really struggle with like classic fantasy and classic sci-fi. The characters just don't really work for me. They feel very surface or 2D. And I've heard that in the sequels to this, the characters are really fleshed out and explored more. And I think because they squished 2 books into this one, like the first and the second, into just one volume, that it felt really squished and it felt really fast paced. And that's a good thing when it comes to plot, because you want it to keep moving, but I only gave it a 3 stars, and the audiobook narrator really saved it for me. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have continued. So it's just a series that I've found that I wanted more of a character aspect to it, and the 2 characters at its center are both rogues and they're both thieves, and they find themselves in a situation where they're set up and framed for the murder of the king. So I was like, this is going to be amazing. It's got such potential for characters and for turmoil and for maneuvering and for action. But while there was a bit of action and stuff, it just didn't interest me as much as I thought it would. So I read this while I was in recovery from jaw surgery, and I was listening to it on audiobook, and that's why I finished it. So I'm not going to continue this. I don't really feel the need to, and that's all I really need to say about it. And then finally, you might be surprised that this is on this list, because I really enjoyed this, or not really enjoyed, but I enjoyed this more than I thought last year, and it's Dune by Frank Herbert. This is a book that I gave 3.75 stars. It wasn't quite a 4 because I didn't love the last third of this book. It had a very white savior trope, but it was also published in 1965, so it makes sense that it had that trope quite heavily in here. I liked the world building, I liked the characterization, I liked the magic kind of vibe that was set up in the background to this. And I thought when I started this that it was a standalone, but it turns out it's part of a 6-book series, and because I don't really love the whole classic sci-fi, I don't really read classics either. This really had that classic vibe to it, where the writing was drawn out and where I really had to concentrate, and while there were cool scenes that were fast-paced and action-heavy, it still felt like it was in that same style of reading a classic. And so I look at this and I go, oh, I know this is a long 6-book series. I really don't see myself being able to commit to this, because it took me a little bit of a push to finish this. And so I liked it, but I feel like I don't have that same energy to like push through something at the moment, because I've really struggled over the past 2 years, as we all have in various ways through the pandemic, to like motivate myself to be concentrating on stuff and just to commit to things and hold myself accountable. So I think if I put this on a TBR list, or the rest of the series on a TBR list for 2022, it's really not going to go my way. So I'm just cutting my losses, and I might return to this in the future, but for the moment it is 100% DNF. And that brings me to the end of this video. So if you've DNF'd any series, let me know. I would be interested to find out. If you haven't DNF'd any series, if you're thinking about it, or if you don't know what to say down below, just put some animal emojis in the comments to let me know that you are here. But thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you down below, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.